I want to take you through one of the ways in which I've gone about exploring how to measure consciousness. And I want to also put as a disclaimer there's been a lot of conversation during this meeting about what consciousness is and how we might find metrics or come up with a theory. I'm not doing that today. I do want to make mention of the fact that people have been dealing with the hard problem of consciousness for a very, very long time. There have been philosophers for, many thousands of years who've actually been sitting around trying to figure out what it means for us to be conscious. And this is definitely one way of characterizing that hard problem of consciousness. So rather than getting into that or having to come up with a definition, another approach, which is very fruitful, is to say we as a room would all agree on certain states of consciousness being diminished. We don't have to have a shared definition yet, but we believe that they're diminished. One of them is sleep, another is anesthesia, and a third is coma. So the question is, what do these things have in common? And anesthesia is a really, really interesting one because it is something that can be voluntarily controlled by somebody outside. So every patient is a dynamic neurophysiological experiment. They are a system that we can perturb. And when we put an anesthetic into that system, it takes a system from being awake and aware, and it drops it into these depths of unconsciousness, and then we wash the anesthetic out. And somehow that brain is not damaged, then they come back. And this is just what this kind of looks like. This is in the Simulation Center of Stanford. The only reason to put this up here is to show what it looks like to map consciousness in real time during an operation by putting a set of hydrogel electrodes on the forehead of a subject and watching their brainwaves in real time. And you can actually extract, because I'm not going to go through any of the science. For those of you who know some neural signal processing, this is a spectrum of a patient who has gone through a 3-hour anesthetic. There's a lot of noise at the very beginning when the person is awake, but you can see when they lose consciousness, that LOC, that a lot of the high frequency, which is mapped on the y-axis from 0 to 40 hertz, drops. And then these two very prominent bands in the delta and the alpha range come up. And then when I wash the anesthetic out of the brain, whoosh, all of those high frequencies come back. And you can see that characterized by these peaks. This is about a minute before and after patient basically loses awareness. And you can see that there is that very, very prominent in red 10 to 12 hertz oscillation that pops right up spectrally when somebody is anesthetized. But here's the problem. These are two spectrograms from a mouse that has been sleeping or anesthetized. And look at the spectral signature. It looks actually quite similar. But I think all of you would agree with me that you couldn't cut into a mouse or a human that was sleeping without them waking up and screaming, but you can when they're anesthetized. That's why modern surgery is possible. So we may need something other than spectral characteristics to characterize consciousness. So the spectrum is one thing. We can also look at what these brains have in consciousness, and when a brain is sleeping or it's anesthetized or it's comatose, the brain breaks down functionally, so it is not as functionally connected. Another metric is information integrated theory. I'm not going to say too much about it, Christoph, because that's your domain, but you can actually look at how the brain calculates and processes information. But you do need more density in order to do some of these things, especially things like functional connectivity. Whereas I only had 1 to 4 electrodes available to me, partially because people don't have hair and people are lying back. So the question is, could we use any other methods to figure out how unconscious a patient was using just a few leads? And the answer to that is complexity. We chose to look at something that characterized was asserted for entropy. The way to think about entropy is how rich is the signal in information? How many potential microstates can a brain that expresses more entropy move into? So that's what we did. And we used, again, propofol to do this. And what we found is that when a patient is conscious, if you were to trace out something that looks almost like a chaotic attractor of their brain, it's spherical. It can go in many directions. The signal is very rich. And as I begin to have that consciousness diminish and diminish, it begins to shrink into a cigar and then into a pencil. And finally, if I have a patient that's really deep, their brain looks like a singularity. And then when I wash the anesthetic out, it goes in the opposite direction. And I happened to mention during the fireside chat a couple of days ago that going down doesn't look the same as coming up. There's hysteresis, but you can wash it out. And although this did not come up in the Black background, we are trying to do this in the intensive care unit as well to save senior brains. What's also interesting is that you can put other states of consciousness on a similar metric scale. So one of them is actually meditation. And meditation happens to increase entropy, which is very interesting because what it's saying is that the signals in this state are also rich and they are full of diverse possibilities. Another thing that increases entropy are psychedelics. And psychedelics not only increase entropy, but they also tend to increase other metrics that show that the brain is also traveling down pathways that are not as common. So it actually decreases coherence along certain pathways. And that's how it might introduce the kinds of flexibility and neuroplasticity that we see. So just to sum up, I just kind of created this last night. I tried to put a bunch of states based on their attractor shapes, where they might be on this two-dimensional system. These are not the only two dimensions that you could use to map states of consciousness. But if we were to look at complexity on the x-axis and integration or coherence on the y-axis, most things kind of track linearly from coma to anesthesia to deep sleep, waking. But meditation is actually really way up there. It's actually shows a lot of integration and it has a lot of complexity. The dream state actually also has a lot of complexity and richness, but the patient's arousal state is very, very low, and there is actually less coherence. And then psychedelics are way off to the other end. So anyway, I just hope that might give you, since we've been, arguing for a couple of days about what consciousness actually is, this might give us a conceptual framework with which to talk about it and study it. Thank you very much.